Yeah, so my name is Becca, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm, as Trisha said, the new education coordinator at the Edible Garden Project. And this series last week and this week is my kind of first foray into the role of actually the teaching part of my role. So it's nice to be here, and it's nice to learn alongside you as well. I'm going to just show you kind of what the general overview of the day is going to look like. But I'm going to start by doing a land acknowledgement. I know that most of us are in a similar area. There may be people either here today or later watching from other parts, not based in what's known as Vancouver, but I always encourage people to look up and see whose ancestral land you are gardening on. So I'm coming from the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Unceded meaning that the land was never given up, and in taking it away, livelihood of the Indigenous people was also taken away. And so the way that most of us garden, not everyone, but for sure at Lutet Farm, is a colonial kind of practice of gardening. We try and be as responsible as we can be, but there has been food grown and soil tended and relationship to plants and land here on this land since time immemorial. So this is only one way of growing food or growing gardens. And so for us, we would like our kind of goal as settlers is to centre Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing as much as we can, and to defer to them when it's something that we don't know about. So what I can talk about is what we do, but I do encourage you to seek out resources and to know whose land that you're on and what other practices there may have been going on for a very long time. So some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the Edible Garden Project and with Lutet Farm. Sorry, let me just tell you what we're going to be doing today. I'm jumping ahead of myself. So I will give you a quick overview, but then we're also going to be talking about soil and the difference between soil and dirt and why this is important. Some of the kind of the main four things that we kind of want to know about soil when we're thinking about having really good soil for our garden. So the structure of it, the components of it, the life amongst it, and the pH, how to create and maintain healthy soil, good soil, the difference between like soil in our garden, in the ground, soil for seedlings, soil in containers, amendments, things that we want to add to the soil. It's a bit about composting, and then some seasonal kind of tips and considerations. So the Edible Garden Project has three parts to it. We share, we teach, and we grow. And our kind of mission is around creating a community culture that values local food systems and food justice and access to good food, and the ability to grow and eat good food. So we grow in our garden space, actually two spaces. We grow at Lutet Farm, which some of you may have been to before, in kind of Lynn Valley area. It's just under an acre, and we grow all sorts of things there. We have some greenhouses, we grow some things outside. Right now there is mostly just garlic and getting the soil ready, but we have some seedlings going in one of our greenhouses. And then we also have a couple of garden boxes at Sutherland Market Garden at Sutherland Secondary School. And the stuff that we grow there is sold at our markets twice weekly, starting in May. May 7th is the first market. So on a Wednesday afternoon and a Saturday, you can come and buy lots of delicious produce. And then there's also other vendors, local vendors there as well. This is what it used to look like. It actually used to be like a garbage dump, and then we now have like playing fields and a beautiful farm that looks like this. It doesn't look like this today, but it will look like this very soon again. We also have what we call sharing gardens, and this is a good time to note that most of our work is volunteer driven. So there's me, there's Claire, who's a farmer, the farmer, there's a couple of farm hands and interns, but everything else is driven by volunteers. So we have sharing gardens dotted around the North Shore that are volunteer run, and the produce from those gardens go towards the food bank and other organizations similar to that, so that everyone can have access to good food. And then we teach, so that's me. We teach in a few different ways. We teach like this and other, so hopefully in person at some point again, classes and workshops for adults. And in the community, we teach, there are 3 schools currently that have school gardens that I go into once a month, or sometimes more than once a month, to do garden-based learning. And then we have all different sorts of people who come to the farm, who sometimes, if they're like totally fresh and new to growing into the farm, they have a tour of the farm. Sometimes they're doing work in the farm, planting seeds, and that kind of goes all year round, including the summer where we have camps and all those kinds of things. You're always welcome to come and check us out, or volunteer if you would like to. We're always looking for people who want to come and help out. Right. So soil. If you were here last week, I touched on a little bit about this idea that when we garden or farm, what we're actually kind of gardening is soil. We feed, when we're thinking about like feeding the garden, we're feeding the soil, not so much the plants. The soil is alive. So soil it's an incredibly complex ecosystem full of all sorts of things that I will kind of talk a bit more about as we go on. And dirt is soil. We say dirt is soil that's out of place. So like dirt on your shoe or dirt at a construction site. That's not the same as soil that we're growing in. So soil really should be like quite dark, and the dark color comes from a lot of organic matter. Again, I'll be going a little bit more into detail about that as we go on. And out at the top part of the soil, the topsoil produces 95% of our food. It's like incredibly rich in nutrients and like an incredibly complex ecosystem in that very top part of our soil. So kind of like the top inch or so of our soil, and that takes hundreds and thousands of years to form. It doesn't mean that that's not going to be ready to garden in now, but that it is an ever evolving thing that we tend to over a long time. And soil is one of nature's most complex ecosystems. It holds 1/4 of the world's biodiversity. There is something like more than 1,000 invertebrate species per square meter of soil. In a gram of soil, there's millions of organisms. But 33% of the world's soil is currently degraded, which is from intensive agriculture, chemicals, machinery, climate change, development, all those kinds of things. So when we're thinking about soil to garden, if you haven't gardened like at your home before, or in a piece of land that you've wanted to garden on, there is some planning, which as we've all probably noticed, it's been cold and rainy, maybe a little longer than we would have liked here in Vancouver. But thankfully that gives us time to kind of get our soil ready to go. So beginning to garden is all about building good soil. So soil is composed of 40% of minerals. Minerals can be sand, silt, or clay. That's the mineral component of your soil. 10% of organic matter. So that's like compost, mulch, those kinds of things that we're putting into the soil. 25% of what is water, and 25% of it is air. And that's kind of like what we ideally want. So not all soil is going to have this like breakdown. Some of it's going to have, too much air or too much water, or not quite the right type of minerals. So our first kind of job is to think about like what does the soil I'm working with look like, and how can I make this really nutritious and really robust for growing in. So the soil has some jobs. Its jobs is like one of the main things that we can think of is it holds the roots of our plants in place. It gives our plants space to grow downwards. So when we're growing, often you might see on like a seed packet how much space a particular plant might need. Some plants need a lot of space. Artichokes need like a lot of space. Lettuces need a smaller amount of space, but generally we want a good depth, so like even like 12 to 18 inches to be able to go down into is kind of ideal for if you wanted to grow a variety of things. The soil feeds the plant, so that's where it gets all its nutrients, and it mitigates moisture. So when we have a good, healthy soil, we're getting not too much and not too little water. And again, we can think about what that means for us living here. Obviously, we get a lot of moisture, a huge amount of moisture. So we have to kind of think about what do we need to do for our soil to make sure we're not getting more moisture than we would like. And then it is a good environment for microbes and microorganisms. That's who we're feeding, who in turn creates the nutrients in our soil. So a good place to start is to learn about your soil. So I have a couple of garden spaces. I have a garden box on my roof, and I have a plot of my community garden, and they're going to both need quite different things. So to start with, and this is a kind of good time to be doing this because it's wet and it's cold, and so you might have started seedlings inside already, but you may not have put anything outside, and that's okay if you haven't done that yet. To start with, we kind of want to get to know the soil. So there's like 3 things that help us know a bit more about our soil. The pH of the soil, if it's acidic or alkaline. NPK, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So the nitrogen is what gives us healthy green leaves. The phosphorus is what gives us like good flower and fruit production. And the potassium is what gives us healthy roots. So we want a good balance of those things. And I will go into more detail as to what that means as I go through. You're also wanting to think about, am I going to be planting right into the ground? Am I going to be using containers? Am I going to be starting seeds inside? They all kind of need different things. So for example, if you're starting seeds inside, you'll want a sterile soil. That's the one time we don't want lots of things growing in the soil, versus outside, you might just use a potting mix, an organic potting mix or something like that. You can always add diversity as you go. So you can always be adding organic stuff throughout the time that you're gardening. So I know for me, when I first started gardening, I felt a lot of overwhelm, especially there's lots you can read, there's lots of information. And sometimes for me, that overwhelm meant doing nothing because it just felt too scary and hard. The great thing with gardening is a lot of it you can do as you go. If things don't work, it's okay. And then so the mineral part of it is the clay, silt, or sand. And so they give different things. So for example, if you have really sandy soil, it doesn't retain water very well. So if you were like near the beach and the sand around there, when we water it, it dries really fast because the water just runs down into the water table and back out again quite quickly. And obviously we need water for the roots of our plants. If you have really clay kind of soil, it retains water really well. So that's good, but it can retain water too much. And when there's too much, there's not enough like space for oxygen to get in there for things to move around, like all the kind of microorganisms to move around, but also for the roots to have a good way to move as well. So I'll show you kind of how you can test for those things coming up, and easy tests. I like an easy test.
Becca, I'm just going to pop in here. Someone was saying, is seed starting mix considered to be sterile soil to start our seedlings in?
Great question. Yes. So when you buy seed starting mix, it should be usually on the package. Often on the package, they'll say if it's sterile or not. And so you can be looking out for that. But mostly if it's dedicated for seed starting, yes, it should be. And it is slightly imperfect because like anything, even when we're testing our soil, we bring it into if I'm using something at home, there can still be fungus that can get into it. But for the most part, yeah, if you're buying a seed starting mix, it's designed to not have a bunch of extra stuff in it. And usually it's been treated like with heat to kill off any like organisms and fungi and bacteria and stuff living in the soil. So yeah. Okay, so the structure of your soil is another thing to think about. So oftentimes people come to the farm and they like pick up our soil and they're like, wow, the soil's really great. And what they're noticing is it's dark and it's kind of crumbly, like a cake, like you hear bakers talk about like a cake crumb, similar thing. And what that means is it's not too like sandy, it doesn't just kind of fall apart. And it also, when you squeeze, it doesn't stay in that like a hard kind of clump. It kind of comes apart. So when, I guess I just kind of mentioned a little bit about the mineral part of things, and I'm going to show you next how you can test to see like what type of mineral structure that you're working with. But you can be adding things. So one thing here that we mentioned is rock dust. You can buy it and you can just sprinkle it in. So if you know that most of the cool thing about soil is generally, aside from the pH stuff, generally it's the same answer for everything. So if you have soil that's too sandy and if you have soil that's got too much clay, the answer is always more organic matter, compost, aerate your soil. It's almost always the same. So that's kind of a helpful thing to know. It can be really easy to get really in the weeds and think about all of the science of it. But so rock dust is going to always be a helpful thing to kind of add the right amount of minerals to your soil. You can just sprinkle it on, rake it in. You kind of can't overdo it. So it's not ever going to be too much. But I'm going to show you this next slide. So this is one way, and I'll leave it up here while we talk in case you're wanting to look at it or take notes. And I'm going to also, in a second, I'll put a video in the chat in case you want to grab that, of what this actually looks like. I'm a really visual learner. I need to watch things happen. So this is one way of testing for how much, like what is the kind of mineral makeup of your soil. So you grab some soil, put it in a jar. If you're in like a garden bed, like grab it from a few different places and mix it together, because it might be different in different parts of your garden, especially if it's not a container. And then you just want to pull out any like rocks, roots, any like big things, break up any clumps. Add some water, put a dash of dish soap, shake it up, and then kind of leave it and mark on the sides as you start to see the layers. And this will kind of show you, then you can kind of like, if you have a centimeter of sand and like 10 centimeters of clay, well, we know automatically there's like way too much of one thing versus the other. In the video that I'm going to put in the chat, it also talks about, there's a tool that you can go to online that if you want more detailed information of what type of the name of your soil is, you can find that. So let me just pop this in. And this is also a video, this is also a video showing you this test. They don't use the dish soap, so I guess it's not essential. I'm not sure why I just can see that someone was asking about the dish soap. I'm not sure. I know that dish soap can like break things down. Like there's a science experiment you can do with dish soap and milk, and it can like break down fats and stuff. I don't know if that's what this is for. I'm not really sure, to be honest.
I'm poking my head in here too, because I was wondering about that as well.
Yeah.
I've done this soil test a lot. I've never done it with dish soap, and it's totally fine.
Yeah.
I would probably suggest, unless it's some great camping dish soap where it's very neutral for your soil ecosystem, probably leave the dish soap out, because I've always found it to be just fine without soap.
I think so too. Yeah, I didn't make this one part of the slide, so I was like, maybe there's something magic to it, so I should leave it in there. But,
maybe there is. Who knows? Maybe I'd have more magic if I'd done it with the dish soap. But I think it's been fine without, and it really effectively shows you the different layers.
It does. It's a really great and easy way of, and it's just cool to see, especially if you've got kids as well. Like it's a really cool thing to watch happen. Yeah, if anyone uses the dish soap and figures out what the magic is, please tell us. I would love to know. Another way if you're just like out in the garden, or you're like trying to choose where you'd like to garden, and you kind of have a sense of you want to have like a quick sense, is to just literally grab a hunk of soil in your hand and squeeze it. And if it's sandy, it's not going to hold its shape. Like if you squeeze it and it like automatically like straight away falls apart again, then we know probably there's more sand in this than we'd like it to be. If you squeeze it and it like becomes really firm and you tap it and it stays in that kind of clump, probably there's too much clay. So the main thing with these is that it's just the size of it. So sand is the biggest particles, clay is the smallest. Again, showing that clay, and again, we want both of these things in certain amounts. We just don't want an imbalance, because we want the roots of our plant to get enough water and enough oxygen. So we want kind of a bit of both. Oops, sorry, let me just go back one. So if we think back to the pie chart we looked at before, there's different makeups in the sand. There's different ways in which we can get these things. So minerals, the clay, salt, sand, make up 40-ish% of our soil. And like we were just talking about, it kind of gives us the water and the air. We want our soil to be a bit porous. So giving some like air to it is useful. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as I go on, but I will just say here that, using, some people obviously till their gardens, some people don't want to till their gardens, and there's a reason why we don't want to do too much tilling in the garden, but using a pitchfork or a small fork before your plants are going in, to kind of just like dig up a little bit of the top of the garden is always a great idea, to get a little bit of air going on in there. You just don't want to go too much, because there's also things alive in there, and we want them to remain alive and not be chopped into pieces. Also, any roots that are in there, aside from things that are invasive and harmful, any roots that are in there that have been like either mowed over or pulled out or used, little roots that we can't see, they're aerating the soil and giving our soil good structure as well. The organic matter, the humus, is about 5 to 10% of it, and that's decomposed plant or animal matter, so manure, leaves, compost essentially. Yeah, I will be talking about more detail about composting at the end, but just we always kind of want to be adding organic matter. That's kind of like there's no silver bullet, but if there was, that's one of them, is like always having this organic matter in our soil. When you're kind of first learning about your garden, if you're going to be gardening in different like beds, test different parts of it. Like I said, it might be different in different parts of the garden, especially if you have, someone mentioned this last week actually, like if you have a garden that's like under a pine tree, that might be more acidic because of the needles that are getting into it, versus one maybe on the other side of your property that's not. So yeah, basically the right mix means that the nutrients, there's nutrients for your plants, there's good drainage, and air is reaching the plant roots. So that's kind of what we're aiming to happen when we test all these things. So soil, as I said at the beginning, is alive. It's full of all sorts of tiny little animals and beings. And they play really important roles. The main one that we often kind of think about is that they're giving us nutrients for our soil. So when we're feeding them, really we're feeding them. An easy way to kind of think about it is with worms. That's something that most of us probably haven't encountered in the garden. And so when we feed or put organic matter into our garden, the worms or other microbes, algae, bacteria, protozoa like amoebas, those kinds of things, consume the organic matter in whatever way they consume things, and then their waste provides the nutrients for our garden. So that's another reason why we don't want to like overwork our garden too much. And we want there to be worms in there, we want there to be bugs in there. Obviously there are some bugs we don't like as much, but a healthy soil is a soil that is full of other living beings, fungus included. They all kind of have jobs of making rich soil. So the pH of our soil. So some of us will be familiar with the scale. Some of us might have to like cast our minds back to like high school science. But yeah, soils have a pH, everything has a pH, every living thing has a pH like amount, I guess. And so soil is happiest when it's at about a 7, a pH of 7. Some things, which I'll talk about in the next slide, there are some plants that are like more excited about acidic soil, some plants less excited about acidic soil. So if you find like, oh, my soil's quite like, it's not at 7, it's like it's a little bit more acidic, it's like at a 6 or a 6.5, that's okay. It's not like that's not going to work and everything's going to die. Just some plants will like it better than others. But it's a helpful thing to know, because if you're really wanting to grow something that we know hates acidic soil in your acidic soil, then that's going to be frustrating for you, and vice versa. So you can purchase soil testing kits if you'd like to, and test the pH of your soil. When it becomes like too acidic or too alkaline, it can just mean that the plants aren't getting the nutrients that they need, depending on what that plant likes. Also, sometimes if there's too much water, which is Vancouver, it can become too acidic and what we call anaerobic, so like not enough oxygen. So that's where, again, we just need to add some things, like the mulch, like the organic matter, that kind of stuff, aerating it a little bit, a bit sandier, a bit less clay, to kind of help some oxygen be in there. So yeah, for us in BC on the coast, often our soil is more acidic than not. And obviously things grow very well here. Like Trisha mentioned this in the last week, like berries, blueberries, they love it. But as I'll show you in the next one, not everyone loves it. There is a pretty easy way of helping to kind of neutralize that, which is adding lime. And then also, if you'd like, depending on your kind of how you're growing, rotating things through your garden. So not always growing the same thing, the tomatoes in the same spot year after year after year. So at the farm, we rotate our crops every year. And that's partly, it's just kind of good soil management. When plants are growing, they're removing nutrients from the soil, right? They're taking nutrients, and then we remove those nutrients by pulling out the plants and eating them, which was the point. That's what we're trying to do. But we need to be able to kind of be putting those things back. So because different plants like different things, we can kind of decide like what goes where, and be not having to constantly amend or constantly like try and figure out the pH of the soil. So one way of doing this is, and I know that not everyone has a garden that's big enough to have like 4 different beds. So sometimes, it's not a perfect thing. You can do this on 3-year rotations, or you can grow one thing 1 year and maybe a friend grows something else the next year, and maybe you have, the more community gardening the better, maybe that's how you do it. But basically what you would do is kind of in late winter, early spring, you might apply lime to the space of your garden. So when you buy lime, it will kind of tell you like how you need to mix that up. So how much you need to apply, sorry. So you sprinkle the lime over the garden, rake it in, mix it in, and then that first year you're going to grow things like brassicas, so cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, mustard, kales, other leafy greens. And they are going to like that soil that we've kind of reduced the acid in. The next year, we would grow like legumes, alliums, so peas, beans, onions, shallots, leeks, garlic, and they're still using a little bit of last year's kind of lime in the garden. So there's not quite as much, but it's still got a little bit of that. It's not, the acidity is not coming back quite so much. The third year, you are going to grow things like cucumbers, melons, summer and winter squashes, and solanums, which are like peppers, eggplants, tomatoes. So they don't mind it starting to get a little bit more acidic. And then in the fourth year, the last year of the rotation, in this particular way of doing things, your root crops, potatoes, carrots, parsnips, beets, they love acidic soil. So they're going to be really happy. If you're like, oh my, this feels like too much and I don't have enough room to do all of this and my soil's really acidic in my backyard, maybe that's where your root crops are going. And maybe in the front yard, that's where you can kind of be really trying to get it a little bit less acidic, and that's where you can grow your other leafy greens and things like that. So this is just one possible way of working with the acidic soil. This is a basic soil recipe, and I've got another one next. So if you're starting a garden with no soil, if you're like making new beds potentially, or you're digging up, you're filling up containers or digging up a part of your lawn, which I'll talk a bit more about in a bit, then you need to bring in some kind of soil. So one thing you can do, which is totally fine to do, is to just go and buy it. If that's something you can go and buy, go to the store, buy organic soil. It's nice to add other things to it. So like peat, or core fiber, which is like the coconut fibers. Peat is not a very sustainable, unfortunately, resource. That we need our peat bogs to offset carbon, and so some people are trying to use a little bit less peat, but you could use some of it. Compost, some sand, some perlite, fertilizer, like organic fertilizer, and then we just kind of like mix all these things together and let them sit. Another thing you could do if you're going straight onto the grass is put down something that blocks the sun, so black plastic, or some people use cardboard, and leave it, weight it down, and in the winter time, or in the end of the fall, peel it off in the spring and see if you've killed off your grass, and then you can start to till that up and use it. If you have a grass that you know is like really rhizomatic, so that their roots are like everywhere, then you're probably going to need to pull that up. But if not, or if it's just another patch that kind of has a few things growing in it that you want to turn into a garden, and that's another way of doing it. This is another mix for container beds. So either peat moss / the coconut fiber stuff, garden soil, which you can buy if you like, compost and sand, and then the perlite, the vermiculite. That's the stuff that is giving like making it porous, so making it not so packed and heavy and tight, letting the water and the air move around. If you are like starting, so some other ways of kind of starting is using those recipes, or you can do something called lasagna gardening. If you Google lasagna gardening, there's a ton of videos that will show you how to do it. But basically what lasagna gardening is if you have a patch of lawn or yard that you'd like to turn without having to dig it up or building a bed, and you put down, again, you start off, you can do this at any time of the year, but it is ideal if you can starting it in the fall for spring planting. If you haven't done it and you're really excited about lasagna gardening, try it now. Like, it's totally fine. It's still very dark, it's still very wet, so we're kind of okay. But you'd put down like newspaper or some kind of like kind of light blocking layer, or you can like dig up your grass and flip it so that the grass side's down and the soil side is up. And then you add like moss, various like manure, compost, leaves, wood ash, and you kind of just go in layers of like brown stuff, green stuff, brown stuff, green stuff. And eventually that starts to break down. It does take like months to do it. It's not like a fast project, but if you're thinking, oh, I really want to turn that patch in my yard, which again, and we'll talk more about this next week, into a garden, that can be a fun way of doing it. And the last thing just to note about kind of getting your soil started is, especially once you've started to plant things, but even beforehand, you don't need to be really working it. So you can use a rake, you can use a pitchfork or like a trowel, and just a little bit of working to kind of get things mixed in. Once you've done it, leaving it be is kind of ideal. And then each season you can like kind of redo things or move things around, but we want to let the microorganisms in there do their job. They don't want to be chopped up. They want to eat the organic matter you're putting in. So yeah, this was a bit about the soil and starting seeds. So like someone asked, finding something sterile is ideal. This is when we don't want mold, fungi, insects, earthworms in there, because their job is to eat organic matter, right? And so there's like a disease problem. There's also like, oh, cool, I'm going to eat this up. So we want like a sterile environment to start our seeds. And then when we transfer them, by the time they're ready to go outside, they're okay to be in a non-sterile environment. Store-bought soil is the easiest way to do this. It's very dependable. They've figured out the ratios for you. So that is what I do. And the diversity that we want in gardening comes later on, once they're in there. It's a good idea if you're starting seeds inside or outside, actually, is to monitor the soil temperature. So seeds want to germinate. They vary from seed to seed, but most of our like warm season kind of edibles prefer between about 21 to 26-ish degrees Celsius. That's what they like to germinate. So if you're knowing like what we've been thinking for the past few weeks, man, it's still really cold outside. There might have been things we might normally have put outside that we haven't yet because they wouldn't have done anything, whereas inside we can keep them a little bit cozier. So that's just something to consider. Or if you've put things out and you're wondering why nothing's happening, if it's been really cold, that might be why nothing's happening. You can get thermometers to test the temperature of your soil. Some considerations if you're using containers, which is a great way to garden. There's some real positives. So they warm up faster. They retain kind of that heat. They also dry out more quickly. So they need more watering. We need to make sure there's like enough, they're deep enough. So I was talking kind of like the 12 to 18 inches is like, we really want that much room, both down and a little bit of room on either side of the plants. And we want some way for the water to drain. So we're not having that, what clay does, right? That logging the water in there. The good thing about the fact that they need more, like we might not think this in the summer when we're having to constantly water them, but a plus side to having to water them frequently, containers can be a little bit more likely to have disease, just because so that both like plant disease and in the soil. But because we're often out there, like constantly in the garden watering, we usually catch it ahead of time. So those will be things like, and I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat for you. One just generally about container gardening, and one that's kind of thinking a bit more about the diseases you might spot. Again, thinking about that kind of feeling overwhelmed by information piece. Many people contain a garden. Don't worry too much about it. If we see things like, oh, why are these leaves like brown when they're not meant to be, we can kind of figure it out then. But the main thing is just making sure that there's enough space and enough drainage. Those are the kind of the biggest things that we want for containing gardening. So amendments. I mean, amendments don't have to be organic. We strongly recommend that amendments to the garden are organic. So this is amendments is anything we're putting into the soil to help it be the way we'd like it to be. The reason why we always recommend organic is simply because a synthetic amendment generally kills things, which we don't actually want to kill things. We want things to be alive, both our plants, but also the soil. And they're very, like, synthetic amendments are very, very concentrated. So especially if we're just doing, you have like a little small garden out the back, it's a lot of chemicals. There's also, it gets into the water, it runs off into our water tables. So I'm always very pro like organic amendments. So as we said earlier, the plant doesn't, the soil or the microbes in the soil eats it, and it takes time. For us here in Vancouver, we can sometimes have not the amount of nitrogen that we would like. So that's that NPK I talked about earlier, which you can also test. You can get test kits for that to see what your garden's doing. But there are things we can put in, so like coffee grounds are a great thing to add to our soil. I'm going to put one more link because I saw this the other day and I thought it was a useful one of this is someone talking about free things to add to the soil. You don't have to go to the store and buy a ton of stuff. There's all sorts of stuff. Yeah, I see that Trisha's talked about like leaves, manure, most of the stuff that we can add to the soil. So this, the guy in the video, he went to like a brewery, which we have a million of in BC, went to a brewery and got like lots of waste products. Organic waste products are great for our gardens.
And sometimes in the springtime when we talk about soil, people go, oh no, I missed the boat. But no, you're just super early for this fall, right? So you can do some things in the spring, but then you can look forward to this fall and think about going to your coffee shop and your brewery and getting leaves and all of those good things.
Totally. Yeah. It's a constant cycle. So we're constantly doing it. And also just, you know, like, so at the farm, at the beginning, we dig in our compost, and then throughout the, I said the semester, throughout the season, we top dress it still. So there's mulch that we'll put on. So usually either compost or leaves or straw. But that's also to put back, it's to help like retain moisture, but also gives us a bit of nutrients. So we can be continually adding things throughout the season. It's just not quite the same as at the beginning. But yeah, I think Trisha's right. Like now's the time to start to look for like, have stuff ready to go for next fall. Most potting soils have enough nutrients that you don't really need fertilizers until you've transplanted the seedlings. So if you're starting seeds inside, you don't need to do anything to them. In fact, fertilizer can burn the roots of plants, and so really the best fertilizer is compost and then mixing in some leaf mulch. And the cool thing about the video I shared as well is when this guy was finding like the various things he found around his city or location to put in his garden, it created a lot of biodiversity, and it's all local stuff. So that's always going to be great for healthy soil. But yeah, you can use manure. That's a great source of nitrogen. It definitely needs to be mature manure, not fresh. Mushroom manure, alfalfa meal, kelp is great for, it breaks down really easily. It releases potassium. Alfalfa meal is a really low intensity fertilizer, and it has a broad spectrum of nutrients. So that's a great one. It's a byproduct of growing alfalfa. There's all sorts there, and I can, if it's helpful, I guess I've got a list here. I wonder if it would be a helpful thing for people. Maybe at the end I'll ask if anyone would like this kind of list with all the various things. I mean, there's so many things that you can amend your soil with, but so long as it's organic, that's the main thing that I would be thinking about. Oh, I didn't realize I just changed this one. Yeah, avoid the intention to over apply or apply too early. And like I've been saying throughout, this is an ongoing process. When we harvest our plants, we're removing the nutrients from the soil. So we just need to continually give it more. So it will grow more things. Generally you're applying like 2 to 4 weeks before planting, and the reason that is when we apply whatever we're applying, the microbes in the soil have to eat it. So the nutrients become available after that has happened, not like it's not the like the leaf mulch itself, it's what decomposing is the thing where we're getting the nutrients. So we want to give it some time to kind of dig it in and let it like mature in the soil. And like I said, we use compost and leaf mulch, and we dig it in the spring, and then throughout the season we add extra on top as we feel like it is needed. There are some plants here down the bottom, some that like we call them light or heavy feeders. So some are going to take more than others. So that might be something to consider if you're wanting to like having to add stuff throughout the season. Potatoes, beets might not need as much as maybe tomatoes or cucumbers or things like that. Here's a bit of the basics of composting. You can compost hot or cold. So cold is kind of what many of us have probably seen or have maybe in our gardens. It's just a big old pile in the back. You just kind of let it be. You can totally do that. It's low. You don't need to do much to it. The one thing is, if you're adding kitchen scraps, bury it in the center of the pile. Otherwise, you're going to get lots of friends coming, insects and animals coming to check that out. Definitely avoiding weeds if you're doing this kind of like low care type of composting, because they'll, especially weeds that still have seed heads on them. So you can use clippings and stuff from your garden, but things that have seed heads on them, or weeds that you're trying to get rid of, you're just going to give them a place to grow if you put them in the compost. So having a separate kind of place where you can dispose of those is ideal. And you just want a good mix of green and brown materials. Generally not wanting to add like fat or meat or dairy. And that takes about a year to do it that way before you'll be able to use it. You can also put like egg cartons, those kinds of things, cardboard. Ideally breaking things up into small pieces, that's going to happen faster if you do it like that. So that's, if you have like things you've pulled out from your garden that you're wanting to put into there, like chopping them up, it's just going to make things go a bit quicker. The other way is what we call like hot or active composting. So it's a similar idea. Often you'll see these in more of a container, like you might have seen those ones that you can spin, or and these ones you are going to be like constantly turning and watering. It wants to be wet and it wants to be moved around. And the reason we call it hot is because it gets hot in there and it kills off any like weed seeds or any disease causing organisms. So that's a plus for this one. You can kind of put more things in it, but obviously it's a bit more work. Another plus for composting in this way is that you get to use it quicker. So if you're turning it every other week, in like 1 to 3 months, there'll probably be compost to use.
Becca,
or within a month.
I'm just gonna poke my head in here.
Yeah.
I thought this would be easier than me typing it out.
Yes.
Green and brown. Can you do a little explanation of what is green and what is brown? Because green and brown is not always the color green and brown.
That's true. Yeah. So, and green, so there's like that's a good question. A carbon and a nitrogen. So like green might be like kitchen scraps, like sometimes I think of it like kind of like quite like fresh looking things. So yeah, like my we call them capsicums, like bell pepper scraps, not going to be green or brown, those kinds of things. And then when we have things like our like drier often looking things, cardboard, obviously, that kind of stuff, wood or like, if you've been pruning, like twigs, dry things like that's kind of like the more brown type stuff. I think that mostly the best thing is you just want a mixture of things. So if we're just using lawn clippings, for example, it's not going to do a ton of stuff. It's not going to do much. It needs to be a variety of things to kind of decompose together. And hopefully they'll get some worms in there. I'm going to talk about vermicomposting actually. But yeah, you want to kind of encourage a lot of diversity of stuff in there. Yeah. Speaking of worms, you can vermicompost if you'd like. There might just be worms in your garden. That's great. We want them there as well. But vermicomposting is like specifically using worms to compost. So you can build one of these, you can buy them. You can generally, so it's a bin. They don't like to get too hot. They kind of like to be like between like 10 to 20, maybe not even 20, 10 to 15, 10 to 16 degrees Celsius. So like I was thinking of putting one on my roof, which would be probably a nightmare in the summertime. But basically, it's a bin with worms in it and food scraps and a bit of soil, and the worms will eat the scraps, and then eventually their castings, their poop, creates the compost that we use. So if you're going to build your own one, and actually, again, like if you Google vermicomposting, there's a million resources online. You give them some newspaper, some dead plants, some dry grass, some water, and then just put in your garden your food scraps in there. I know my sister, she just did this, and there's some things also grew in there. So she had she was able to transplant a pepper plant that grew in the compost. But generally you want about, if you're, and again, this is like slightly imperfect, but you want about a square foot of space for like container space, for about a pound of weekly scraps. That's kind of what you want to have going on in there. But yeah, you can, like I said, so you can see and here they've, like, you can just get a bucket and give it some and use that. You want to put sort of like some holes and stuff in it, or you can buy them. It's a great way, and this one is like, it's similar to the hot composting, but you're not really having to do anything, which if that's kind of more your style, then this is a useful way of composting. I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to try and just scoot on to a couple of tips. So yeah, seasonal tips. So in spring and summer, this is when we want to like aerate. So we use a broad fork. You could do it with a pitchfork. So just like lifting up a little bit of the top of the soil without disrupting, all of the layers underneath. It also gives you an idea of how deep it is and what you're working with. Like if you're aerating and you're like hitting hard soil, or it's like really, really wet down there, then we're like, okay, maybe I need to kind of do something with the soil. Putting in mulch, putting in compost, digging it in. Generally, and this goes for fall and spring and summer and fall and winter, soil doesn't like to be uncovered. That's the kind of the main thing. So if you come to the garden now, to the farm, this is what it looks like. And then the rest of our beds have got a tarp over them, a plastic tarp over them. That keeps weeds out as well. And it kind of keeps, it allows all the kind of microorganisms underneath in there to be like mulching away all the stuff that we put in there, or we put in there at the end of the last growing season. So yeah, layer of mulch, let it break down. And then you can also plant cover crops if you would like. So clover, pea, legumes, kind of that kind of thing can be planted. A cover crop is useful. It takes over, and it like prevents like invasives, hopefully, from kind of growing, but also the roots of the cover crop are aerating your soil for you, so they're really helpful. For fall and winter, always piles of leaves. Like just get as many leaves as you can, stack them up in your garden. People, and especially in the city, like they pay to have their leaves removed from their garden. It's not going to be hard to get people's leaves from them. So as many leaves as you can find, and just let them kind of sit in some bags, and then put them out in your garden. And that's also going to kind of protect the soil over the winter. Also, when we get a lot of rain, it's going to help not all of the nutrients that we have still left in the soil run off, and kind of we lose all of the work that we've done. You could also plant a cover crop at the end of that season as well. If you don't want to plant a cover crop, just consider how are you going to protect your soil from the elements. So maybe you also want to put like plastic over it, or in my garden plot we just put cardboard over it at the end of the season, and we hope that there's not going to be too many weeds underneath it when we come back. But yeah, just we want to put it to bed at the end. And sometimes the cover crops you plant, like red clover, I use that for tea. But generally you can just kind of trim it back and then let the roots stay in there, and it's ready to go. Yeah, I think that is us. I can see I forgot to plug my computer in. So while I go and grab my charger, if
Don't leave us, Becca.
We're right back.
All right. So there's lots of good questions in the chat. I'm just going to go scooch back, and some people might have been following along in the chat. Some people maybe not. So we've been having a good conversation about various types of amendments. So Sherry was mentioning coffee chaff, which is I guess the exterior of the bean, which I haven't actually personally used. but it sounds like a great brown material that would be available all year, unlike leaves, which just fall from the trees at one point. And then someone else was asking about coffee grounds. So I would put my personal coffee grounds in there. I have sometimes, when starting a big garden bed, gotten coffee grounds from coffee stores. If you're trying to go fully organic, they may not be fully organic. So that's something to consider. And typically when you get them from stores, they're not all that wet, but they are a little damp. So just consider that. Someone was mentioning earlier that they wanted to compost, but were concerned that their compost might be smelly. And we were talking about in the chat, if you have a good balance between the green and brown materials, then everything will start to cook and compost and turn into nice soil and will not be overly smelly. But the one thing that I really consider, aside from not dumping in too many green goopy materials that actually do have their own smell, is also thinking about the overall wetness of your compost materials. Because if you're in Vancouver, it's wet in general. Moisture doesn't always evaporate as easily in the early spring. And then you're also adding a lot of wet materials. You just don't want your compost to get anaerobic, because anaerobic is what is really stinky. It smells like that dead sulfurous type of smell. So if you're finding you're getting that, then that means that you have a lot of gloopy stuff in your compost.
Totally.
And you need to start adding more leaves or coffee chaff or whatever have you for your brown
and the
materials.
smell, like obviously we don't want the smell, and the fact that we don't want the smell is a good thing, because the smell, it smells gross, and that's telling us something's wrong. And that's when we need to put some more like brown stuff. The brown stuff is kind of like going to help aerate things and bulk things up, and not just be the kind of the gross stuff basically.
And I also added, if you scroll back a little bit, and we can add this when we send this out, I also added a YouTube video that was linked to from the city of North Vancouver on composting in bear country. So if you are local and you're North Shore, the other reason you don't want to have really delicious smelling compost is because you need to make sure that you are not attracting bears. And the Black Bear Society is awesome at that. So if you do have a question about composting and bears, then they're great to talk to as well. Lucy's a great advocate for bears and making sure that they're safe. I'm just going to scooch through all of our questions here, because we have lots of good ones. And someone had asked if they could share slides. I think if you connect with Becca, could you possibly put your
so my email address is, I can put it in here in the chat too, but it's just there on the
so just before sharing any of them on social media, maybe just connect with Becca about what to share.
And if you have any other questions as well, feel free to email me.
Absolutely. And let's see, we've done a few of these already. We had a conversation about removing rocks, and I added my opinion, but I'm interested in yours. So my note was, if I'm starting a new garden bed, I would make sure that I'm not adding rocks. Because especially with root vegetables, you don't want them having to work around the rocks, and then you'll just get some funky carrots. But if you do have some rocks in your garden, it depends on what you're growing, right? So if you're focusing on building soil at the top, then and you're growing lettuce or something, lettuce probably doesn't care, because it doesn't have a very deep root system. But if you're trying to make epically large carrots, then you might care a little more. And it depends how much you want to disturb your soil structure by removing rocks. So
I would say the same. And like if it's a new space and you're worried about that, I think at the beginning, especially if you're kind of newer to this, like if it's a ton of rocks, then like that's not going to be ideal. But the kind of the top part is the part we're really interested in, aside from if we're growing, like I would remove rocks, but if there's some left behind, it's not going to be the end of the world.
And Lutet Farm is pretty much built on rocks, and it's great.
exactly. Yeah, it is.
So they just built up the soil above the rocks. So
Yeah,
over
yeah.
the years, you can certainly make an effort and do that and build your
Yeah.
soil on top of just about anything.
Totally.
There were a couple that I didn't get to answering in the chat. There was a question about ants in the compost bin and just concern about ants. I said I wasn't personally too worried about ants, but ants also like a drier soil. So if you have a nice balanced compost, you might not have as many ants, but I'm not personally too worried about them. Any thoughts about ants and compost and things?
I think I feel the same. I mean, and also if ideally, I mean, I know ants are very, very small and good at getting in spaces, but they're like, if you wanted to like buy a compost container, if you're having it inside, like generally they try to be made as a way to keep compost and other things out as best as possible. But I also am not too worried about it. So maybe we're not the right people to ask, like, what's a few ants? How bad can it be? Yeah, that's like sometimes that you might just, that's the kind of part of gardening. I think sometimes we just get extra bugs that want to come and hang out with us.
And from my perspective, which is more like, it's sort of like an ecosystem perspective of your garden. So that's where I tend to come from, is looking at those animals that you have in your garden as part of your garden ecosystem and thinking about, like, are they playing a role that you need them to play perhaps? And so that, to me, that's fine. They're not necessarily an indicator of something bad going on. If you do have a lot of a certain animal, like aphids, and you're saying, oh, like, what's going on with all these aphids? Then you can look at what is going on in your garden to lead to that and make some strategies around that. So they might be coming to a plant that is less healthy. So then you could look at, how do you improve your garden soil and your watering and make sure your plants aren't stressed, so then you don't have that problem. So that tends to be my approach to things. Let's see, I'm just going to make sure that we got many of the questions here. Someone was asking, we didn't get this one, is it too late to add leaves now? I've had some sitting around since the fall. So if they're sitting around in a container, they might be partly composted already.
I think it would be okay. Awesome. Yeah, especially if they're kind of like they're still like damp. Like I would like go in and like kind of dig through them and see kind of, are they breaking down? And I think that's always going to be okay to like use it as a mulch kind of on the top as well. So even if you're not like digging it in, yeah, I mean, like for me, my garden, like the garden plot, I've barely starting. Like I've had it for a while, so obviously I've been doing this kind of throughout. But I am probably still gonna like add at least a little bit of something on top. So
yeah, and I would think, like, this time of the year, just thinking about your leaves and what you're adding on top of your soil, like I would just be thinking, if you're going to be seeding directly, then think about how big the stuff is that you're adding on top, so that you can easily plant your seeds and the seeds can easily poke through. So
and you can save it for later on in this growing season too, to kind of mulch over top once you've got your plants. And you just, when you're applying things to the top when there's plants growing, you just want to not apply them up close, touching the like stem of the plant. If you're mulch, you're putting straw on top or other types of mulch, because it can rot the plant if they get too wet. But yeah, you might be able to use it later in the season.
Yeah, that's a great idea too, because recently the summers have been getting quite hot and dry in Vancouver. And so sometimes, like a summertime mulch, you were mentioning, soil doesn't like to be naked, right? Soil needs things on top of it. So if you are out in the summer and looking at your garden and things look a bit wilted, then adding some protection on your soil can help the plants maintain the water underneath the soil. When you're watering early in the morning, then it doesn't all just evaporate immediately as soon as it gets hot, right? And someone was asking about plastic, and I think I missed this because I was typing madly at that time. Doesn't it make it too hot? So yes, you want to make sure it doesn't make it too hot.
No, especially because we're putting like for us at the farm, we're putting it down at the end of the fall and kind of starting to pull it up now. So the temperature is cold enough out there that it doesn't matter. And yeah, so generally not. It's like, I think if we were doing it in the middle of the summertime, they probably wouldn't love it. But right now, no, it's fine. Yeah, generally you'd have pulled it up by the time you're starting to plant, and you were actually keeping them nice and toasty in the temperature they like over over this. And that's why there's lots of advice to like not start raking leaves or tidying up kind of in your garden too early, because there's also things that we want that will be hibernating in the mulch or whatever plastic, whatever we've put down in our garden over the end of fall and winter. There are like pollinators that hibernate, and so we want to kind of wait until things are like around the 10-degree mark more consistently before we pull things up, so that those various bugs of various sorts, pollinators and also in our soil, are ready to be out in the elements. Safe to use.
And in a few weeks, in later April, I'll be doing a workshop this is our last garden workshop actually, about pollinators. And that's one of the big things to think about over the winter time, is just making sure that you are not keeping your garden too clean in the springtime or the fall, because if you keep it too clean, then you actually inadvertently get rid of some of your nice bugs that are trying to do good work in your garden and trying to pollinate and things. So last two questions here, and then we'll wrap up. Someone was asking about mulching with wood chips over the winter, and what do you do? We often have this question too about big leaves, like big leaf maple leaves. So if you have bigger chunks of brown material or mulch, what would you do in the springtime with that?
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of I think, and this is always my answer, and I know it can sometimes be an annoying answer, that it depends so much on what you're looking at. But what I would be doing, so we just I had a similar thing happen at the farm, and we pulled back our tarp to see what things were looking like, and we just kind of like stuck our hand and then to see like how much of this has broken down, because if some of that stuff has broken down, some of it might have, like I know that we're not talking about like kind of like the wet leaves and stuff, but if any of it has kind of broken down, then I would be like, I'd want to be leaving as much of that in the soil as possible, and not just removing all of that stuff that might have started to break down and like turning it in. But yeah, otherwise, like if it's not done there, and you're wanting to start sowing like directly or put your seedlings in there, then you are going to need to move things around. So it's the same kind of thing, I guess, as the mulch question, like what we talked about earlier, of not having them, like having room for things to grow, but also not having that kind of mulch that can get wet in the spring right up next to your plants. So that it's kind of a twofold answer. I know it's not like a perfect easy yes or no answer. Just check and see if is there stuff breaking down that I can dig in, or should I be raking or moving some of the stuff up the top so that things can grow up and through it. I'm doing. Yeah.
So last question, someone was wondering about aerating their soil and how deep they should dig. So tilling is always one of those controversial things. And so it depends on whether you choose to till in your garden. And I prefer just to leave things and add material if possible, because that way you don't disturb the soil structure that all of the roots and the animals have created, and that helps create better soil as you go on. But if you are digging around in your soil, how deep should you dig? That was the question.
Yeah, I mean, similar to you, Tricia, that as like a few inches, like just the kind of like if we think about broadfork, it's quite big, but we are adding soil to the top, so like only like a few inches really, because there's so much good stuff underneath there. So the top few inches can be like fluffy and moved around, but I wouldn't go much more than a few inches personally, because I kind of take a similar approach to Tricia. I try and leave it be as much as possible. So just a little bit.
And there's so many controversies in gardening, and that's one of them.
There is. I know people feel very strongly either way. So whatever works for you, what you feel good about, and also a lot of gardening is a lot of experimentation. Different soils, different gardens, different gardeners, different plants all need different things. So just give it a go. And one other thing I would say for any of it, take notes. Like if you have a little garden journal, especially if you're going to be gardening in the same place year after year, just note down things that have worked, and then you can come back and be like, oh, that's right, I don't actually need to dig down, or that's right, the tomatoes hated it in the corner. They need to be over here next year.
Exactly. Yeah. So thank you so much for coming, everyone. This will be going out to everyone's email probably midweek next week. And please remember, if you are in the great position of being able to turn a lawn into a garden, you can sign up for next week's workshop and tell your friends about it. And there are a couple more sessions after that. The only weekend we're not doing it is the Easter long weekend, because sometimes folks are away, but we wrap up our garden workshops on April 23rd with a workshop on pollinators. So thank you, everyone. We will see you next weekend, I hope.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.